The morning sky over northern Germany was pale and cold. Franz Stigler tightened his gloves inside the cockpit of his Messerschmitt fighter, staring at the instruments as the engine hummed below him. The airfield was still muddy from last night's rain, and the smell of oil and metal filled the air. He knew this might be the last time he ever lifted off from this ground. Fuel was scarce. The war had turned against them. Allied bombers crossed the skies almost daily now, escorted by sleek, fast American fighters that seemed to own the heavens. Franz had seen too many friends vanish in flames, and each takeoff felt like a gamble with death. He glanced at the small photograph tucked into his dashboard, his brother, August, who had been shot down months earlier. Franz still remembered his brother's last radio call, a voice full of static and pain. Since then, flying had never felt the same. It was duty, yes, but it was also survival and guilt. The radio cracked with static. Orders came through. Enemy bombers had been spotted heading east, likely toward Hamburg. Franz's squadron was ordered to intercept. He exhaled, closed his eyes briefly, and then pushed the throttle forward. The Messerschmitt rolled down the airstrip, the vibration rising through his legs until the earth fell away. Up in the sky, clouds stretched like torn cloth. Below, the towns and forests of Germany passed silently. Franz climbed higher, scanning for silver glints of American planes. Somewhere above the clouds, men he had never met were preparing to kill him, just as he was expected to do the same. But this morning felt different. There was a weight in the air, something unspoken, as if the war itself were holding its breath. Franz didn't know it yet, but fate had prepared a strange encounter for him, one that would test everything he believed about enemies, honor, and humanity. As his plane leveled off at 10,000 feet, he caught sight of distant smoke. The first American bombers. He adjusted his course, heart steady, eyes sharp. Far ahead, the sun reflected off metal wings like mirrors in the sky. He whispered to himself, "For August," and dove into the clouds. The wind roared around the canopy as Franz broke through the clouds. Below him stretched the endless gray of enemy territory, fields and rivers stitched together like a giant map. The smoke of anti-aircraft fire floated in the air like dirty ghosts. In the distance, black dots moved across the sky. American bombers, their formation perfect, their purpose deadly. Franz steadied his breathing. The order was clear. Intercept the enemy, destroy what you can, and survive if possible. But survival was no longer certain. Every German pilot knew the odds. The Americans now ruled the air. Their P-51 Mustangs were faster, deadlier, and always waiting above the bomber squadrons like hawks over prey. He remembered the warnings from the officers back at base. Never bail out over enemy lines. Do not surrender. They will shoot you before you touch the ground. It was a rumor that spread through the Luftwaffe like poison, a story repeated in dark corners after missions. Pilots who tried to parachute, they said, were gunned down by American fighters. No one could prove it, but fear doesn't need proof. Franz had seen wrecks of parachutes tangled in trees before, white silk burned by gunfire. Maybe the stories were true. Maybe they weren't. But it didn't matter now. If his engine failed out here, surrender was not an option. Death would come fast and mechanical. He checked his gauges again. Fuel was already low. Ammunition, half full. The numbers told him what he already knew. This was a one-way flight. His radio crackled again, faint voices shouting coordinates, warnings, prayers. A burst of flak exploded nearby, shaking his wings. He ducked instinctively as if that would help. The sky was alive with chaos. Black puffs of smoke, silver planes twisting and diving, the distant thunder of bombs dropping miles away. For a moment, Franz thought of home. The quiet streets of Augsburg, the bakery on the corner, his mother's voice telling him to stay safe. It felt like another lifetime. He shook his head and focused. Ahead, one bomber drifted out of formation, smoke trailing from its left engine. It was crippled, moving slower than the rest. Easy prey. Franz pressed the throttle. His plane responded with a growl. The hunt had begun. But as he closed in, something caught his eye. Movement below the damaged bomber, something strange. He squinted. Holes riddled its fuselage. A propeller barely turned. And through a shattered glass nose, he could see faces. Not soldiers, not machines. Men, scared and struggling. He hesitated, finger resting on the trigger. The sky around him was silent now, just the hum of his own engine and the distant drone of the dying bomber. Every instinct told him to fire. Every rule demanded it. But something inside him whispered no. And in that moment of hesitation, his war began to change. The crippled bomber drifted like a wounded bird, leaving behind a trail of smoke that stretched across the gray morning sky. Franz eased his Messerschmitt closer, the metal frame creaking under the changing air pressure. His gloved hands tightened on the control stick as he approached the giant aircraft, AB-17 Flying Fortress, one of the deadliest machines ever built. But this one was dying. The tail section was shredded by anti-aircraft fire. The glass nose was shattered, one engine burned black, and the right wing carried holes big enough to crawl through. Through the broken windows, Franz could see movement, shadows of men trying to keep the plane alive. He moved alongside the bomber, keeping just enough distance. Inside, the pilot's face came into view, pale and tense. He couldn't have been more than 22. Franz saw another man slumped behind the guns, unmoving. The tail gunner's turret hung open like a wound. Franz could have ended it in seconds. One burst of cannon fire, and the bomber would fall. But his finger froze on the trigger. Something felt wrong. These men weren't fighting anymore. They were trying to survive. Franz flew closer, close enough to see bullet holes punched through the American flag painted on the tail. He looked into the cockpit again and saw the pilot turn his head. Their eyes met through cracked glass. Two enemies in the same sky, both exhausted, both trapped in a moment they did not understand. Franz lifted his hand from the control stick and gestured. He pointed down, motioning toward the ground, a silent command, land. You can still live. The American pilot hesitated. The bomber shook, dipping lower. Franz stayed beside it, guiding, not attacking. Every few seconds he checked the horizon, expecting to see another German fighter appear and misread the situation. If anyone saw this, he would be branded a traitor. The Luftwaffe had strict orders, no mercy, no hesitation. But what was mercy, Franz wondered, if not the last human act left in a world gone mad? Minutes passed. Then, from the west, two new shapes appeared against the clouds, American fighters, sleek P-51 Mustangs. Franz's heart jolted. They were approaching fast. He tightened his grip, preparing for a fight. But the Mustangs didn't open fire. Instead, they slowed down, moving alongside him and the dying bomber. One of them tilted its wings, as if acknowledging him. Franz didn't know what to do. He was outnumbered, deep in enemy territory, and now flying beside the very men he had been told would kill him without hesitation. For a brief, surreal moment, they were all there, German and American pilots, enemies sharing the same strip of sky, the same danger, the same unspoken understanding. Then one of the Mustangs dipped its nose slightly, signaling for the bomber to follow. The formation turned south, away from the battle. Franz watched, stunned, as the American fighters took position, one ahead, one behind, guarding the wounded bomber like shepherds leading it home. He stayed for a moment, engine idling, heart pounding. In a war built on orders, he had just witnessed something that defied them. The sky had grown quieter now. The bomber, limping through the air like a broken-winged bird, continued its slow descent toward the horizon. The two American fighters stayed close, their silver bodies gleaming against the pale light. Franz kept a cautious distance, watching in disbelief as they guided the damaged plane toward safety. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure who the enemy was. He had expected gunfire, the quick flash of tracers ripping through the air, the end that every German pilot dreaded. But it never came. Instead, he saw coordination, protection even. The P-51 Mustangs flew in a pattern, shielding the crippled bomber from any further attack. Franz's Messerschmitt followed at a safe angle, the low hum of the engine filling the space between them. He didn't know whether the Americans saw him as a threat or as another escort. Perhaps they didn't care. Perhaps they understood what he was trying to do. Below them stretched miles of snow-covered fields and forest. The war looked distant from up here, almost peaceful, as if the ground itself was tired of all the killing. Franz kept his eyes on the bomber's tail, still smoking, wobbling slightly as it lost altitude. He remembered the faces he had seen through the cracked glass. The pilot's eyes filled with fear and exhaustion, the motionless gunner, the desperate hands trying to hold the controls together. They were young. Too young. Just like the men on his own side. Franz took a deep breath. He knew he was breaking every rule. If anyone saw this, if anyone reported it, his career, maybe his life, would be over. But something deep within him refused to let those men die. It wasn't strategy or sympathy. It was something older. Something human. As they crossed the front lines, the American pilots adjusted formation again, signaling that the bomber was almost home. Franz recognized the terrain now. It was Allied-controlled territory. One last glance, and he saw the bomber begin to drop lower, preparing to land on a captured airfield near the edge of France. The Mustangs held their escort position until the very end, then broke off gracefully, banking away toward the sun. For a long moment, Franz hovered above the line between enemy and friend, watching the bomber descend safely. He should have turned back immediately, but he couldn't move. The moment felt sacred, suspended in time. These men, who should have been trying to kill him, had just risked their lives to save one of their own. And, in some strange way, him too. Finally, he exhaled and turned the Messerschmitt around. His fuel was nearly gone, his mission abandoned. But his heart felt strangely full, as if something heavy had been lifted from his chest. As he flew back through the quiet clouds, Franz realized the truth. The enemy wasn't the men in those planes. It was the hatred that made them believe they had to kill. And that hatred, he decided, would not claim him. Franz's Messerschmitt glided through the clouds on its return path, the engines rumble softer now, more like a heartbeat than a roar. The sun was beginning to fade behind a curtain of smoke and winter haze. He should have felt relief for surviving another mission, but his thoughts were tangled in what he had just witnessed. He had seen mercy from the very pilots he had been trained to hate. Below him stretched the land torn apart by war. Craters marked the countryside, villages burned in the distance, and rivers carried reflections of smoke instead of light. Every mile of ground had been paid for in blood. Yet, somewhere in that chaos, human decency had still managed to survive. Franz thought of the young American pilot in the bomber, the fear in his eyes turning to confusion, then to understanding. There had been no words between them, only gestures, a shared silence that crossed the language of war. It wasn't supposed to happen. According to the stories, the Americans were ruthless. They burned cities, destroyed convoys, left no one alive. That was what the officers said, what the radio repeated every day. But how could that be true after what he had seen? As his plane shuddered in the cold air, Franz realized that the war was built on stories, half-truths and fears that kept men angry enough to kill. Every nation had its own version. But the truth was simpler, more painful. On both sides, the young were dying for ideas they didn't create. The paradox weighed heavily on him. He was part of a force that demanded loyalty and obedience, yet he had just disobeyed it to follow something his heart called right. What did that make him? A traitor, or simply a man who refused to lose his soul? The fuel gauge blinked near empty. He adjusted course toward a makeshift airstrip deep in German territory. The plane rattled as he descended through rough air. Below, smoke from burning vehicles rose like black pillars. The war never slept. When the wheels finally touched the ground, the jolt brought him back to the present. He rolled to a stop, engine coughing, and sat there for a moment, motionless. The world outside was gray and silent except for the distant thunder of artillery. He pulled off his goggles and looked at his hands. They were trembling. Not from fear, but from something else, realization. The men he had been told were monsters had shown him humanity. And that truth was more dangerous than any bullet. Franz climbed out of the cockpit, his boots sinking into the mud. The sky above was the same cold blue that stretched across the front lines, above friend and foe alike. He stared at it for a long time, wondering how many others were looking up at that same sky, asking the same questions. The days that followed felt unreal to Franz. The mission had ended, but the memory of that broken bomber and the faces inside it refused to leave his mind. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the pilot's expression, that flicker of gratitude through the cracked glass, that moment of shared recognition between enemies. He began to question everything. The officers still gave their briefings, filled with talk of duty, victory, and sacrifice. Propaganda still blared from the radios, promising that Germany would rise again, that the enemy was nothing but savages. But Franz had seen something different. He had seen compassion. A few weeks later, his luck ran out. During another mission, his Messerschmitt took heavy fire over France. The engine burst into flame, and with no choice left, he bailed out. The air ripped at his parachute, and the ground came up fast. He hit hard in a field near a captured airstrip, pain shooting through his shoulder. American soldiers surrounded him within minutes. Guns were raised, voices shouting in English. Franz froze, hands lifted high. He expected hatred. He expected a bullet. But instead, one of the soldiers lowered his weapon and shouted for a medic. They carried him to a tent, bandaged his wounds, and gave him water. An officer asked his name, his rank, his unit, all in a calm, measured tone. There was no shouting, no insults. Later, someone handed him a metal cup of coffee. It was warm, strong, and the first thing he had tasted that didn't feel like war. Franz couldn't make sense of it. These were his enemies, yet they treated him as if he were just another man who had been unlucky. When the medic noticed his torn flight jacket, he patched it. When Franz winced from pain, the soldier gave him a sympathetic nod. Days passed in the prisoner camp. The Americans were strict, but they were fair. Every morning, Franz watched the guards share cigarettes with prisoners. He saw them speak kindly, even joke at times. It was not what he had been told to expect. One evening, the sound of music drifted through the camp. It was swing, the kind of lively rhythm band in Germany. Franz sat on his bunk, listening to the melody slip between the tents. It made him think of a world before the war, a world of dancing, of laughter, of life. Something inside him softened. The bitterness that had grown over years of loss and propaganda began to fade. He realized then that decency was not a weakness. It was strength. It took courage to show mercy when the world demanded hate. And in that quiet camp, surrounded by the very people he had been ordered to kill, Franz began to understand what freedom truly meant. The prisoner camp came alive each evening when the day's work was done. The guards relaxed, the tension in the air loosened, and the sound of music floated across the rows of tents. Someone had brought a radio, its antenna patched with wire and tape. The crackle of static gave way to the bright swing rhythms of American bands, trumpets, saxophones, and that unmistakable drumbeat that seemed to carry joy even through the dust of war. Franz sat on a wooden crate near the fence, his hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee. The smell of campfire smoke hung heavy in the cold air. Around him, prisoners murmured quietly, some staring into the flames, others just listening. For a moment, the war felt far away, almost like a bad dream fading with the night. A young American guard, barely older than the German pilots Franz once flew with, sat nearby tapping his boot to the rhythm. He noticed Franz watching and grinned. "You like swing?" he asked in slow, careful English. Franz hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "Before war," he said, his accent thick but his meaning clear. The guard chuckled. "Before war, everything sounds better." They shared a laugh, small, brief, but genuine. The kind of laugh that made Franz forget the uniform on the other man's shoulders. It reminded him that beneath all the orders and symbols, people were still just people. The music changed, softer now, a song with a gentle melody. One of the prisoners hummed along quietly. Another started tapping the edge of a tin bowl like a drum. Before long, the rhythm spread. The guards didn't stop it. In fact, one of them even whistled in tune. Franz closed his eyes. For a few minutes, he wasn't a prisoner or a soldier. He was simply a man sitting among others, listening to a song that belonged to no country. When the song ended, silence fell again, but it wasn't the heavy kind. It was peaceful, the kind that comes when people understand each other without words. The young guard stood, brushing off his uniform. He looked at Franz and said, "You know, maybe one day, we'll all be on the same side. Then he walked away into the dim light of the camp, his shadow long against the tents. Franz sat there, turning those words over in his mind. The idea seemed impossible, yet somehow it felt true. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. He took one last sip of his coffee and stared at the stars above the barbed wire fence. They were the same stars that shone over Germany, over every soldier and every home. For the first time in years, Franz felt something return to him: hope. Spring sunlight filtered through the wire fences, soft and golden, a color Franz hadn't seen in what felt like forever. The war was ending. You could feel it in the air, in the way the guards no longer shouted as much, in the quiet between the sirens, in the rumors whispered between prisoners. Something was changing. One morning, as Franz helped carry crates to a storage tent, an American officer approached him. The man's uniform was clean, his tone calm, but his eyes carried the kind of weight that only pilots shared. "You were Luftwaffe?" he asked. Franz nodded. "Yes. Fighter pilot." The officer studied him for a long moment before offering a faint smile. "I flew B-17s. He paused, as if debating whether to continue. "We lost a lot of good men up there." Franz met his gaze. "So did we." It wasn't an argument. It was a truth. A quiet bridge between two soldiers who had fought the same sky. Weeks later, Franz was transferred to another camp where officers and pilots were kept. One afternoon, while waiting for food, he overheard a conversation in English. The words "escort mission" and "France, March 45" caught his attention. The voices spoke of a damaged bomber that had been guided to safety by fighters, and by a German who had refused to finish them off. Franz's heart stopped. They were talking about that day. His day. After some hesitation, he stepped closer and introduced himself. The American pilots looked at him, puzzled. One of them, a tall man with weathered features, stared hard, then slowly nodded. "You were the one in the Messerschmitt." Franz could barely breathe. "Yes. You were in the bomber?" The man's expression softened, disbelief turning into something else. "I thought you were going to kill us." Franz smiled faintly. "So did I." They both laughed, awkward at first, then louder, the sound echoing through the camp like something breaking free. They talked for hours that evening, about the mission, the fear, the strange peace that had filled that morning sky. They discovered they had both survived because neither of them had followed what war demanded. That American pilot was Captain Charles Henderson, the same man whose eyes Franz had met through the shattered glass of a burning bomber. When they shook hands, there was no triumph, no pride, just quiet respect. Two men who had seen the worst of war and chosen not to add to it. Years later, long after the camps were emptied and the uniforms were put away, Franz would think of that handshake. To him, it was the real end of the war. Not the signing of papers, not the silence of guns, but that simple human gesture that said, "We understand each other now." After the war ended, the world tried to put itself back together. Cities rose from rubble, soldiers returned home to silence, and nations began to rebuild what years of hate had torn apart. For Franz, freedom did not come with celebration. It came with reflection, slow, heavy, and often painful. He found work helping with aircraft maintenance for the Allied forces. It was strange at first, wearing no uniform, speaking to men who once aimed their guns at him. But the Americans treated him with decency, the same way they had during captivity. They paid him fairly, shared their rations, and never reminded him of the past. That quiet respect left a deep mark on him. Franz noticed something different about how the Americans handled victory. They didn't crush the defeated. They rebuilt them. Roads were repaired, food was distributed, and the occupying troops enforced order without cruelty. There was discipline, yes, but not vengeance. In the years that followed, the contrast became clear. Other prisoners he knew, those who had fallen into Soviet hands, spoke of camps where hunger and fear ruled every day. Many never returned. Franz understood then that mercy could be as powerful as any weapon. One morning, while working at an airfield near Bremen, he watched American soldiers hand out supplies to German families. Children laughed as they received food and chocolate. It was such a small act, yet it meant everything. It showed that humanity could survive even after years of destruction. Franz remembered how propaganda had once painted the Americans as monsters, ruthless killers who destroyed for pleasure. But the truth before his eyes was different. They were builders, healers, even friends. He began to see the pattern in what they were doing. The Americans weren't just ending a war. They were planting the seeds for peace. They were showing that compassion wasn't weakness, it was strategy. By treating their former enemies with dignity, they were shaping a future where hatred could no longer take root. Franz often thought about that while repairing planes. Machines of war could always be rebuilt, but rebuilding trust between nations was something else entirely. It required patience. It required forgiveness. And it started with moments like the one he had lived. A choice not to pull the trigger, a shared act of mercy in the sky. As years passed, Germany changed. The country that once fought for domination began to fight for democracy. The airfields that once launched attacks now welcomed visitors from around the world. Franz watched it all unfold and quietly understood why. Because when one side chooses humanity over hatred, history bends in a different direction. The years rolled on like calm waves after a long, violent storm. Germany was no longer the shattered nation Franz had once known. The ruins were slowly replaced with buildings, the hunger with industry, and the silence with the hum of new beginnings. Franz found his place in that renewal through the skies. Flying had always been his life, and now he returned to it, not as a soldier, but as a civilian pilot. Commercial aviation was growing fast, and he joined the new airlines that carried passengers instead of bombs, dreams instead of fear. Every time his plane lifted off, he felt that familiar thrill, but it was different now. He wasn't hunting. He was guiding people safely across borders that had once been drawn in blood. Each takeoff was an act of peace. Still, the memories of the war lingered. Sometimes, as he looked out over the clouds, he thought of that B-17 bomber, of the young American pilot who had looked back at him through shattered glass. He wondered if the man had survived the years after the war as he had. Then, in 1989, more than 4 decades later, a letter arrived. The handwriting was careful, the ink slightly faded. The sender was Captain Charles Henderson. He had spent years searching for the German pilot who spared his life that day. When Franz read those words, his hands trembled. He hadn't been forgotten. The letter was short but filled with warmth. It spoke of gratitude, of the strange mercy that had changed 2 lives. It ended with a simple invitation, "Let us meet again, this time as friends." Franz agreed without hesitation. They met in a small hangar in Canada, where Henderson now lived. The moment Franz saw him, older but unmistakable, the years seemed to disappear. They walked toward each other slowly, unsure at first, then embraced without a word. The sound of engines from a nearby plane filled the silence, a fitting backdrop to their reunion. They talked for hours, about the war, about the choices they made, about how that single act of mercy had shaped both their lives. Henderson admitted that he had never forgotten the German pilot who refused to shoot. Franz replied that he had never forgotten the American who showed him what humanity looked like. By the end of that day, they were no longer pilot and enemy. They were brothers. A photograph captured the moment. 2 old men standing beside a small aircraft, smiling. That picture would later be printed in newspapers and history books, a quiet symbol of reconciliation between nations once divided by hate. Franz knew then that his story had come full circle. The skies that once carried war now carried peace. And the same courage that once spared a life had helped heal 2 nations. By the time the world entered the late 20th century, the scars of the war had begun to fade, but the lessons it left behind remained. For Franz, one lesson stood above all others, that decency, even in moments of chaos, holds more power than any weapon ever built. He had seen cruelty up close. He had seen what blind obedience and propaganda could do to nations, to friends, to himself. Yet he had also seen the opposite, compassion from supposed enemies, kindness that defied orders, and humanity that refused to die even when surrounded by hatred. In those early post-war years, American commanders made a choice that few empires in history had ever made. Instead of destroying their defeated foes, they rebuilt them. They poured resources into Germany and Japan, not to humiliate them, but to help them stand again. It was a new kind of victory, one rooted not in fear, but in understanding. Franz watched that strategy unfold with quiet admiration. He saw how schools reopened, how streets were repaired, how trade and cooperation replaced suspicion and revenge. It wasn't perfect, no recovery ever is, but it was built on something stronger than conquest. It was built on the belief that peace lasts longer when it is shared. He often thought of it like flying. If one plane in formation drifts off course, the others do not open fire. They guide it back. That was what the Americans had done after the war, guided their former enemies toward stability, not punishment. Over time, the results became clear. West Germany rose from the ashes to become one of the most prosperous nations in Europe. American soldiers once stationed as occupiers now walked the same streets as friends. The hatred that once fueled battles slowly gave way to cooperation, to shared purpose. Franz realized that this was not a coincidence. It was a calculated act of decency, a recognition that mercy could shape nations more effectively than vengeance ever could. The humanity he had seen in that single encounter in the sky was the same humanity that now shaped the world. Sometimes, while sitting on the balcony of his small home, Franz would hear the distant hum of jet engines. He would look up and smile, thinking of how far the world had come since the days of propellers and smoke. The sound no longer meant danger. It meant connection, people flying across borders, across cultures, freely and without fear. That was the true power of decency. It didn't just save lives. It changed the course of history. The older Franz became, the quieter his world grew. The noise of engines and warplanes that once filled his days was replaced by the hum of morning wind through the trees outside his home. Sometimes he would walk to the edge of a small airfield near Munich, where private planes came and went, and he would stand there watching the sky as if greeting an old friend. Each takeoff reminded him of everything that had passed. The missions, the faces, the choices. Especially that choice. The moment he saw the crippled bomber through his gun sight had defined his life far more than any victory ever could. He had often wondered what his brother would have thought. August had died believing in orders, in the idea that duty was everything. Franz had once believed that too. But the war had stripped those beliefs bare, forcing him to see the man inside the uniform, the human beneath the enemy. Sometimes he would tell his story to young pilots who came to listen. He didn't lecture them. He simply spoke about what it means to carry both power and responsibility in the sky. Every pilot, he would say, has a moment where he must decide what kind of man he is. The airplane doesn't make that decision. You do. He never claimed to be a hero. In fact, he often said that refusing to kill an already dying crew was not bravery, it was simply right. But deep down, he knew that this single act of mercy had changed more than his own fate. It had changed how he saw the world. When he looked back on his years in captivity, he remembered the small details. The taste of that first cup of coffee, the laughter at night when the Americans played music, the way kindness appeared in the most unexpected places. Those moments had rebuilt him from the inside. He realized that humanity survives not because of grand speeches or victories, but because of small choices made by ordinary people at impossible times. The decision to share food. To listen instead of shout. To hold fire instead of pull the trigger. Franz wrote these reflections in a small journal, his handwriting neat and deliberate. The real victory, he wrote once, is not in who shoots first, but in who dares to show mercy. As the sun set one evening, painting the horizon gold, he looked up to the same sky where everything had once begun. The clouds drifted quietly, and for a moment he imagined the shape of a bomber gliding across the light, escorted by fighters, enemies turned guardians. He smiled, because he knew, deep in his heart, that even in war, humanity could still find a way to fly. Years turned into decades, and the world that once tore itself apart began to knit itself back together in ways Franz could never have imagined. The enemies of his youth were now allies, bound not by conquest but by cooperation. Where there had once been walls, there were now bridges. Where there had been silence, there was dialogue. Franz's story spread quietly, first among veterans, then among historians, and eventually to people who had never known the smell of gunpowder or the fear of falling from the sky. It wasn't a tale of glory, but of grace, a simple moment when one man's mercy transcended the madness of war. By the time he reached his later years, his story had found new meaning. His grandson, a young pilot in the modern German Air Force, wore a uniform that looked different but carried the same responsibility. The insignia on his sleeve bore a symbol of peace, not conquest. One afternoon, that grandson sent Franz a photograph from a NATO training exercise. In it, a formation of German and American jets flew side by side, their wingtips almost touching as they cut through the bright blue sky. Beneath the image, a short message read, "We fly together now, Opa." Franz held that photograph for a long time, his fingers trembling slightly. He felt something swell in his chest, pride, gratitude, and disbelief all at once. What had once been unthinkable had become reality. His grandson was flying with the descendants of the men he had once faced in battle. It was as if history itself had come full circle. At public events, people would often ask Franz what it felt like to see former enemies working side by side. He always answered the same way, "It feels right. This is how it should have been all along." He attended one NATO airshow in his old age, standing quietly at the edge of the runway as German, American, and British pilots walked past him, laughing together, exchanging greetings. When the jets roared into the sky, the noise was powerful but not frightening. It was the sound of unity. In that moment, Franz realized that his story was no longer just his own. It had become part of something larger, a living lesson passed down through generations. A reminder that reconciliation isn't built in meetings or treaties alone, but in the hearts of people who dare to forgive. As the planes disappeared into the clouds, he whispered softly, almost to himself, "You see, August, we did it. We found peace." The sky above him shimmered in sunlight, as if answering back. In the final years of his life, Franz often sat by the window of his small home near Munich, watching contrails streak across the afternoon sky. The sound of modern jets no longer brought memories of fear or combat. Instead, it reminded him of how far humanity had come, and how fragile that progress could still be. He spent much of his time speaking with students, journalists, and young pilots who sought him out to hear his story firsthand. They expected tales of daring battles or secret missions. Instead, Franz told them about restraint, compassion, and the weight of choice. He spoke of how mercy, once dismissed as weakness, had proven to be the strongest act of courage. "War will always test what kind of human being you are," he told them. "Anyone can destroy. But to hold your fire, to see the person inside the uniform, that takes strength." Sometimes the students fell silent, unsure how to respond. They had grown up in peace, surrounded by comfort, far from the skies where men once died within seconds of meeting. But they listened. They understood that his story wasn't just about the past, it was a warning for the future. Franz believed that every generation would face its own conflicts, not always with bombs or bullets, but with pride, fear, and misunderstanding. And in those moments, humanity would once again have to choose between vengeance and virtue. He often recalled the day he met Captain Henderson again. Two men who had every reason to hate each other, yet chose respect instead. That moment had proved that reconciliation doesn't start between governments. It starts between people. As the world moved faster, with new technologies and new tensions, Franz's voice remained calm and steady. He reminded anyone who would listen that peace was not something you inherit. It was something you practice. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds gold and red, Franz looked up and whispered, "If I could tell every pilot one thing, it would be this. Never forget that the sky belongs to all of us. There is no enemy up there, only men trying to make it home." He smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the fading light. And though his voice would one day fall silent, the message he left behind did not. It carried forward, in classrooms, in airbases, in stories told by those who believed in something greater than victory. It was a call not for more power, but for more humanity. A reminder that even in the darkest conflicts, mercy can still shape the future. Because in the end, the greatest legacy of any war is not who won, but who remembered to remain human.